And welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you're able to join us today. This series is entitled Reimagining Mathematics Education. And we're really focusing on connecting math, community, and culture. We are just thrilled that you can find some time either to join us live today or watching the recording later on. This recording will be sent to you by email after this session, about a week after this session. Please know that you will not appear in the recording unless you're a presenter. This is the second of 4 sessions, and today we're focusing on Indigenous story work and math education. And we are just delighted to have this focus, and I know that many of you are very excited about this session, as I've been hearing from you over the last couple of weeks. Each of the sessions are from 3:15 to 4:30, and as you can see, our 4th session is still a mystery. We're going to see where the energy is, and we'll create our 4th topic once we kind of have a sense of where we've been. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I live and I learn on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and stolen territory of the Silks Okanagan people as a settler guest. The Silks Nation is to this day and every day forward the rightful caretaker of this territory. It's therefore my obligation to acknowledge, respect, and learn from the Silks and their knowledge, language, and history, as well as from their ongoing relationship to the land and natural world. The Silks have taken care of their homelands for thousands of years, and now that I call this place home, it's also my obligation to aspire towards better understanding of how to engage in respectful acts of decolonization, both personally and professionally. And I just have a few images here of the wonderful work I've been able to engage with knowledge keepers and elders from the Penticton Indian Band, members of the Silks Nation. And over this fall, I've had a chance to be guided through picking mountain tea, off this beautiful, long, bumpy mountain road. I had a chance to learn about pictographs from a Silks perspective and how that's connected to Vision Quest, perhaps career education from a Silks perspective, and so lucky to be part of the Floodplain Reimagination Project, where the Silks Nation has Indigenous scientists, and then we are working as Western scientists together with kids, Indigenous and non-Indigenous kids, to repatriate the area with Indigenous plants from a Silks knowledge perspective. We welcome you all from wherever you are joining us from today, and we invite you as a decolonizing practice to say hello in the chat box, and if you know where you're joining us from, to locate yourself on Indigenous territory. There are a few partners in this project working together to make this opportunity happen. I'm so delighted, and you're going to meet Cynthia Nickel next. And so Dr. Nickel and I had a chance, we've been looking for opportunities to collaborate. And so this is one of the things we found, is a chance to offer something across the province featuring voices of BC educators in the work that they're doing. Cynthia works with the Indigenous Math Network, and also the David Robitaille International STEM Education Network. Dr. Nickel is the Robitaille Professor of Mathematics and Science Education. Also, Dogwood 25, the BC Ministry of Education, is a generous partner in supporting us with funds for this series, as well as the Rural Education Advisory, which is a collective of rural superintendents from across the province, spotlighting, highlighting innovative, powerful work that's happening across the province. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll pass the torch to Dr. Nickel.
Thank you very much, Leighton, for the good beginning. I hope I can continue with that good beginning. My name is Cynthia Nickel, as Leighton introduced me, and I'm a member of the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy at UBC in the Faculty of Education. I also hold the professorship as a David Robitaille Professorship in Mathematics and Science Education. So it's my pleasure to help introduce this webinar series on reimagining mathematics education, connecting math, community, and culture. And this particular one is on Indigenous story work within mathematics education. And I first want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of the Hunkaminam speaking people right here on the Fraser River. And you can see how the river is being used both for an industry and how the the ducks there are using it as well. At this point, the Fraser River splits between the North Arm and the South Arm before meeting again in the Pacific Ocean. And I think with the floods happening with our friends and family and colleagues in the Fraser Valley, who I think we're all concerned about and wondering about, I kind of feel very vulnerable in this place as well, but also how I have come to know it very well over these past 18 months during COVID, and how very much my own experiences and memory and place and story are deeply connected. And as a reminder of my own colonial history and responsibilities and obligations to these lands. So I'd like to invite you to introduce yourselves and the lands that you are currently on in the chat, and you can do that now while I'm introducing the rest of our team. So thank you for attending and coming from wherever you are. So we have today my colleagues I'm very honored to introduce, who have helped organize this session and will be sharing their views. We have Joy Fast from the Delta School District. We have Jen Whiffen from Coquitlam, Sandra Fox from Vancouver, Leanne Rogers from Haida Gwaii, Joanne Archibald from UBC, Joanne Jovanovic from Haida Gwaii, and Janice Nowakowski from Richmond and UBC. So together we welcome you and kind of invite you on this journey with us to think about Indigenous story work within mathematics education. And we're going to focus around the stories and experiences of 4 teachers in BC who are working on trying to bring in Indigenous story work within math education. So thinking about stories and Indigenous stories in particular, there are many places that you can find stories. And these are some of the books that I've pulled off my shelf that are possibilities. And we'll revisit some of these a little bit later. But you can also find and think about stories in different places like art and beadwork and oral stories. And they can be in various places that we can find. And a Ojibwe author and storyteller, Richard Wagamese, reminds us that it all begins with story. So I want to introduce to you Joanne Jovanovic of Haida Gwaii to tell us a little bit about Kungunjad. And this is, some of you may already recognize this design. It's by Billy Jovanovic, Joanne's son, who's a very talented young artist. And this is Kungunjad, who is Mouse Woman. And Mouse Woman is a supernatural being who helps think about both the mathematics for us and also story as a way of helping us figure out problems that we might be encountering and how to get ourselves into a solution for it. So I will pass it to my colleague, Joanne.
Hello, Cynthia. Singela, Tanujat Hanudiki Guga. I'm honored to join you all today from my ancestral land of the Haida Nation. As Cynthia has mentioned, our network is guided by Kungunjat, Mouse Woman. Mouse Woman is considered a Haida helper, and she is considered to also be one of the wisest of all supernaturals. She believes that anything started should be finished. She has a goal of trying to make everything equal, brings order to the world. She's found, excuse me, in many pieces of our Haida art and work and our cultural tools that are created. She's in our lives. She's not often always in the forefront, but she's always around. This summer, my son, Billy, shown in this slide, who is the artist, had agreed to create some videos for us with our math work. And so I was asking him questions about math and art and how, as artists, they begin their work, but they begin their work from a point of creating a specific object, and they don't necessarily think about the math involved to create that piece. As you can see on the slide, he said, you know, art is who we are as a culture. It helps make us and defines who we are. The art is so connected to our stories, that is connected to our lives. So all those pieces are important pieces that we need to keep together. He said about I was asking many questions and some math specific questions. And he said, you know, they don't think of it as the forefront, but realize that sneakily math makes its way into their work, into their creations, and it's hidden everywhere. And he had the analogy, it's like almost like Mouse Woman. She's always there. She's always helping. Sometimes you don't know why, but math, like Mouse Woman is always there. And when you go to it, it always helps you find a way to make things work out and balance things. So I wanted to share a little bit of that, and those thoughts are what help us with our math and the story work, and being able to have math, story, and culture all be equal and together. So I'm happy that we're exploring those possibilities today, and I hope you enjoy the other presentations today. So Hawa for listening.
Hawa, Joanne. Okay, so we get to see where Mouse Woman Kungunjad will take us this morning. So we, before we start, we're going to just do a quick little Mentee survey, which I have here. And there will be a link that we can put in that can be put inside the chat. And someone could try to do that, please. Or you can just go to mentee.com and type in this code 9706. And I wanted to not start with that slide. Man, I wanted to start with the previous slide. Sorry. I want to start with this one. So how do you bring Indigenous, or do you bring Indigenous stories into your classroom? So if you go to mentee.com and type in the code, then you'll be able to enter your yes or no to this particular question. And we can just kind of see how we are as a group of, we have like over 60 people. We'll be able to get a sense of what people are thinking. And I don't know if great. Thank you, Sandra, for putting the link in the chat. Okay, we have 15 responses to our survey. Everybody who has wanted to has entered something in to this particular slide. We have way more people than only 15 here. So, but maybe you would like to go to the next slide. And that's this one. How comfortable are you teaching math with Indigenous stories? Not comfortable, somewhat, or not yet, or very. Okay, so it looks like we have maybe, oh, there's a few more, good. Well, it seems as if some of us are somewhat familiar with Indigenous stories and Indigenous story work, perhaps, and have tried some ideas in their classroom. So it'll be great when we get into the questions to be able to share some of those experiences. So now I will would like us to think more about how we could maybe use Indigenous stories in our classroom and what that might look like, and how we can get started with that. So to do that, I'd like to invite Dr. Joanne Archibald Kwangkwang to introduce to us what educators around the world following Joanne's work know as Indigenous story work. So Joanne, I'm going to go back to our slides. There we go.
Great. Hi, Chuck, Cynthia, Swayao, everyone. It's good to have us all together today. And I'm here on the traditional and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. When a Stalo cultural gathering is about to start, the spokesperson who is facilitating the cultural work will say something like, "My dear ones, the work is about to begin." Then the guests who have been invited to the gathering give their full attention to the work that will take place. I developed an approach for learning with Indigenous, traditional, and life experience stories. And I learned this mainly from Stalo and other Coast Salish elders and storytellers. And I named this approach Indigenous story work, so that when that name, Indigenous story work, is used, it signals that it is time to give serious attention to working with stories. 7 principles, as shown on this slide, form the foundation of Indigenous story work. Each principle is like a strand of cedar used to make a cedar basket. Each strand is distinct in its meaning and use, but can be combined with other principles to create beautiful designs and meanings. Ultimately, a basket is created that can be used for many purposes. In this presentation, 4 teacher stories will be shared about bringing together Indigenous story work and math education. The teacher storytellers will highlight the meaning of one or more of these Indigenous story work principles. After 2 stories, we will create time for discussion and questions, and then continue with 2 more stories, followed by discussion time. We will return to the Indigenous story work principles at the conclusion of this presentation for some summary comments. Now, my dear ones, the work is about to begin. Joy Fast of the Delta School District will focus on becoming story work ready with a grade 1 class.
Thank you, Joanne. I am going to share a project that I did with my grade 1 students in the spring, and it is a set of lessons that I developed with one of my colleagues, Mahima Lamba. So I started my work with 2 questions. The first question was how to participate in story that leads to rich mathematical discourse, creating connections through relationship for all students. And the second question that I was exploring is, how can I draw upon the power of story to engage students in mathematical thinking that leads us towards reconciliation? I was interested in understanding the power of story in mathematics and also using the principles of Indigenous story work together. I also wanted to develop my students' connection to the land, and my school backs onto the Delta watershed, which is where this beautiful photo was taken while I was on a walk there with my students. The Delta watershed has a salmon stream that we could walk down to where salmon are released. And there were some teachers in our school who were also raising salmon. Some of them are here, I know. And so we decided to base our lessons around the life of the salmon, which is a keystone species for our existence. And salmon are a species that are rich with mathematics. So using the 4R principles of Indigenous story work to become story ready, the principles of respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and reverence, I started at a place that felt comfortable for me as a grade 1 teacher, which is using stories that are already written by Indigenous authors. So doing the work of becoming story ready myself, I got to know the stories at a deeper level before sharing them with my students. I learned who the authors were, where they were from, and why the stories were important to that place. When I shared the stories with my students, I asked the question, where is the mathematics in this story? And the stories weren't necessarily what we would consider mathematical stories. We spent some time discussing this throughout the different stories we read. We asked questions such as, how do people change the number of salmon? What causes there to be more or less salmon? How do predators change the quantity of salmon? How do salmon change the quantity of other life in the forest? And as we were developing our lessons, we discovered on the Government of Canada Fisheries and Oceans website a mural by a Cree Dakel artist, Clayton Gauthier, called The Sacred Salmon Journey. Once again, I was inspired by the Indigenous storywork principles to learn about the artist and where this mural came from before sharing it with my students. I was beginning to understand the importance of our local place. We have access to stories from all over the world, but to learn the stories of our specific place and to see mathematics in our place creates a level of connection, a sense of responsibility, and a sense of place in this world, a sense of our place in this world. So when we open our eyes and minds to see mathematics everywhere, mathematics can help us to interpret where we're from. I used the mural as a story, and as a class, we looked at the many stories in the mural. We asked questions like, how does this art make you think about math? What is the mathematical relationship between the living things in the mural? And why do you think the artist chose those shapes? I then gave the students story boxes and asked them to create their own stories with mathematics in the story. The images of the animals on the screen are from the Cowichan Valley School District Indigenous Education Department. And we'll put a link to that in the chat because I know that's something people are always interested in after they see the image. But as students began to create their own stories using the story boxes, the productive struggle began. Some students got started right away and told long and amazing stories that had no mathematics in them. Some students told stories that had numbers and counting, but didn't go beyond that. And then there were some students who told stories that had depth and showed rich mathematical understanding. One example of that is a story where a student showcased many math concepts in her story. She was telling a story about 3 creatures eating salmon. She showed her understanding of patterning as each creature caught and ate a salmon. She showed her understanding of subtraction by taking away first 1 at a time, and then to speed things up, she took away 2 at a time. And she knew she wanted to have 1 left at the end. So she realized that 2 of the animals would have to share 1 salmon. So she split the salmon in half and gave each animal half so that she would have 1 left at the end. She showed her understanding of time. So many mathematical concepts were embedded in this short story told by a 6-year-old. What I learned from this experience of allowing students the freedom to share their thinking through story was that allowing students to share their learning in this way opened up opportunities for them to show deep conceptual understanding that was not evident in typical mathematical assessment activities. As part of my own work with Indigenous story work, trying to learn the story and where it came from, I reached out to the artist of the Sacred Salmon Journey mural, Clayton Gauthier. He shared with me how the mural came to be and the story behind it. Through several correspondences, Clayton offered to do a Zoom meeting with my class, and it was an amazing time of learning. He shared his art with us, stories and songs, and we were so blessed to share this time with him. During this project, students lived their own experiences through the stories, activities, art, conversations, mathematics, and play. Students discovered mathematics in personally meaningful ways and shared their thinking and knowledge through their stories, revealing their learning. It all began with embracing the principles of Indigenous story work and using the 4R principles for myself as the teacher to become story ready. So I'm going to now pass it off to my colleague, Jen Whiffen, who is going to talk about her project that embraced connecting to the land and using the principles of Indigenous story work.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Joy. Okay, so yeah, Stump Stories. Using observation and data collection to learn stories from the land. So let's get started. Okay, so the idea for this guided inquiry began with the question, what are the stories of this land? And then a further question of my own, how might we use math to come to know these stories? And I live in a suburb of Vancouver. I'm near a remnant of the great temperate rainforest that stretch sort of up and down the Pacific Northwest coast. And the forest where I walk is second growth, but it's filled with evidence of the forest that came before. So particularly massive old stumps. And when I look at the stumps, I see notches and cuts made by the loggers such a long time ago. And I imagine trees they once were. And think of what it must have been like to see these trees cut down one after the other and milled for shingles like the ones we see here covering Burrard Inlet at the turn of the century. And this is in my home, near my hometown of Port Moody. So the destruction of the forest must have been a stunning and disorienting blow to the Indigenous people who relied on them, not just as a primary resource for their communities, but also as a critical part of their identity. And in this photo, we see the village of the Coquitlam people surrounded by a clear cut, the waters of their river dammed, and the Sockeye Run destroyed after pleading with the Crown not to do it. It must have felt at that time like the world was coming to an end. And when my mind grasped the relationship between stumps and Indigenous people, I realized a crucial truth. The story of what happened to Indigenous people is really held in the land itself. So, and these stumps know the impact of colonialism. They're not dead and buried. They hold the stories of what happened and they are waiting to tell them. They are like the elders. And I'm fortunate to have the job as I'm a mentor of teachers and I get to work with them side by side, modeling practice and exploring possibilities in math. My wonder sort of began with how to support teachers, especially ones that are underconfident or maybe even reluctant, and exploring the ways that math might help surface the stories of these amazing stumps. So I was interested in exploring the potential of the 4 R's of story work to support this work, especially the R of reverence. So in story work, reverence is all about listening with the heart and holding both the storyteller and the story in the highest esteem. Now, this reverential connection is developed through trust, kinship, and deep knowledge of responsibilities. So the question that I try to answer is, how can I help students and teachers hold the stumps in the highest esteem? And my answer was to use film to encourage imaginative engagement. This was particularly helpful during the pandemic when I could not access schools. I used film to introduce students to the stumps as storytellers. Now, if I were to have led this inquiry as a classroom teacher on my own, I would have drawn upon my own understanding of applied mathematics and local history and science and culture to guide the students. And this knowledge of mine allows me to perceive the roots of the idea, as it were. But to support others in such an inquiry, it became clear that I needed to provide them with a means to perceive the important ideas below the surface so that they might guide students too. So resources like the ones you see here, like this guide to old stumps, I hope would help teachers have a better idea of what to look for. I didn't want to give them, just simply give the ideas away. I wanted them to be aware of them so they might nudge students in possible directions. And I also created a bunch of scaffolded lessons to ease them into the process, since many would not try it without the safety of a scaffold. And you're probably wondering how you might listen to stumps. So when the storytellers don't have a voice, you need to use other senses to know the stories. So some things like touch and sight and smell. And this means that to become story work ready in this case, students need to know their responsibilities as observers. So just like Joy found in her work on salmon stories, becoming story work ready is one of the most important components of helping students get the most from their experience. If students enter the forest in an unfocused and noisy way, they won't be in the right state of mind to make careful observations. It's helpful that they know how to enter the forest quietly, to observe gently, and to approach the stumps with respect. The first time I had teachers try this, many who didn't take the time to get their student story ready found that not all of their students made careful observations. And as a result, they didn't gain as much from the experience. So you need to be a good observer to notice patterns and to see the stories emerge. And really, this is where Mouse Woman sneaks in, as it were, right? The stories emerge from a lot from data collection. So the stumps have all kinds of scars on them from the impact of logging, things like burn marks and notches and cuts. And the stumps themselves also support a lot of life. I encourage teachers to not tell students what to look for. Instead, they could give them opportunity to count those features and look for patterns and let them wonder about what they mean. I created lessons and a video for helping teachers and students make sense of their observations by graphing and mapping and discussing. And I also, next slide, I felt that measuring was a good way as well to help students learn the stories of stumps. Things like estimating circumference can help students appreciate who these amazing trees had been. And even estimating distances between them gives them a picture of what the original forest was. I thought it would be helpful to teach children how to use their bodies to measure, since we always carry our bodies with us into the forest, but not often a measuring tape. So this meant another video and another set of scaffolded lessons for this purpose, plus extensions for converting body measurements into metric estimates. And this lovely quote by Robin Kimmerer sums up much of what I hoped to help teachers and students experience with this project. And it was a hope that by paying attention, that really it was a form of reciprocity with the living world. For many teachers, it was the first time they had ever experienced such a thing, which is a real plus. But many let me know that the resources, although they were helpful, they felt they weren't really certain if they had done it correctly. They wanted more support in the project. So I'm still working to make the process more manageable and personal for teachers. My Indigenous education colleagues and I, and Joy Fast and I actually are zooming in on becoming story work ready for observation in the outdoors, and particularly we're working on a project around water, creating prompts and routines that help teachers come to know the process more intimately. And I also continue to work on reverence as a part of that readiness. I believe that holding nature in the highest esteem is really key for careful observation and to really caring enough to wonder and have empathy for the residents of our amazing forests. Thank you.
So I will facilitate this session, this part of the presentation, to invite all who have joined us to ask a question or comment. We'll have just a few minutes for this, but if you could either put your question or comment in the chat, or let us know in some way that you have a question to ask. And while we're doing that, you see that we have this beaded image, and drawing from what Joy and Jen, kind of open-ended, thinking, where's the mathematics in this lovely piece of work? So we might think of that too. So open for questions, comments. Now, while we're waiting too for any question, perhaps I could pose one to Jen or to Joy that I took away from your presentations how important it was for each of you to become story work ready, and I just wondered. Is there a particular principle that you found very challenging? So I'll ask Joy that question first.
Oh, that's a good question. I think the one that is the hardest to kind of initially for me to wrap my head around was the principle of reverence, because it's so all encompassing, and it feels a little bit less practical. Like, to me, respect, responsibility, and reciprocity, they have a really practical aspect to them, but reverence is it's a little bit harder to wrap your hands around and do something tangible with it. But I think what I've come to discover from again, some of the things that Jen was talking about with her stump stories, and some work we've been doing around noticing water, is that when you start to understand what it means to approach something with reverence, then you start to see how that exists everywhere in the world. And it's about opening yourself up to viewing and experiencing things that way, taking the time to see them from a different lens, rather than just with the example of water. I mean, right now there's so much going on in our world with water, but instead of just walking by it unnoticed, to really recognize where that water has been, what it's done. So that's the one I would say if I had to pick one.
Thanks, Joy. Being open, that I feel that's what I learned too, being open, being receptive to what I am supposed to learn, or what might be out there. So, Jen, there was also a question too that relates kind of perhaps to what I've asked, and somebody asked how you're hoping to think about water mathematically as you hold it in reverence.
Yeah, it's a great question. I was looking at that one as well. And it's actually where Joy and I have started and done the most thinking about our this idea of noticing water. And it's important, or what we felt anyways, to inspire this sense of awe, and that sense of holding something in the highest regard. And that requires a couple of things. One, it could be deeper knowledge, which can be inspired by just having information about just how important water is to, say, our own bodies, or to the world in general. And a lot of that involves a lot of numbers. And by the way, to answer another question around the middle years, there are a lot of very complex numbers that tell some interesting stories about just how tremendously important water is to us. And that we have that sort of one piece of building knowledge and building awareness. And then the other is building that sort of personal connection, that sense of memory and feelings of kind of love and respect for water. And we hope that helping people surface their own stories with water from their times in their past, and to take those things and to sort them and compare them and graph them, might be a way for them to tell those stories and to help, to sort of make those reverential connections. So I don't know if that helps to answer the question, but yeah, we're spending a lot of time on that for sure. And the middle years question again. Yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of addressed that, but there are some amazing numbers that, and many of them that I had to take them and simplify them to make them make sense to elementary school students. And all the while I was thinking this would be perfect for middle year students, because there are all these proportional numbers and percentages and fractions, and those are right on the money when it comes to those middle year students. So
great. Okay, thanks, Jen. Well, we can return to the middle years perhaps in some of the other presentations or questions. So we'll move on now to Sandra Fox, who will share her story in relation to a book, Raven Brings the Light. So over to you, Sandra, grade 4 and 5 application.
Thank you, Joanne. Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to share my first experiences of using Indigenous story work and math in a project that I did with my grade 4 and 5 students in Vancouver last winter. When I was engaged with learning about Indigenous Storywork Principles, I was also reading Frances Sue's book, Mathematics for Human Flourishing. And I was inspired by the ideas of math exploration and a quest for meaning being central to mathematics. So I then wondered how the principles of Indigenous story work in helping form meaning from stories might spark students' curiosity for mathematical exploration. I chose to work with a story that was familiar to both my students and to me, Raven Brings the Light. This story is told in many forms along the Northwest Coast, and this written form is what was told to Roy Henry Vickers by Chester Bolton, chief of the Ravens from Kitkatla Village. The story tells of how Weegat, as Raven, travels to the heavens to bring light to the dark earth. Joy has presented on how she became story ready herself using the principles of Indigenous story work, and I had a similar experience. Additionally, I wanted to work with my students to help them become story ready. This involved in giving lots of time in preparation before listening to the story. Some of the features of this preparation included connecting to place, using Google Earth to visit the areas Raven flies over on the way to the heavens, and learning about Roy Henry Vickers as the storyteller. I also introduced the students to the idea of listening with 3 ears, 2 on your head and the 1 in your heart, as a respectful way to engage with Indigenous stories. When I gave this final teaching, some of the students gave an audible as an exhale, and the whole group settled into near stillness, and we were ready for the story. When I started planning to use Indigenous storywork principles and stories with math, I was really determined to address something related to fractions and Raven Brings the Light. However, as I worked with the Indigenous storywork principles to become story ready myself, I came to understand that reverence to place was important. I realized we could explore how the gift of light is experienced differently in communities in British Columbia. So I chose towns and villages and areas that Raven flies over in the story, and showed the students sunrise and sunset times on the solstices. We engaged in a what do you notice and what do you wonder discussion. And displayed here are some of the wonders. I asked the students which of the questions might be answered with mathematics, and as a group, we chose to explore how much daylight each community had on the solstices. As the students worked, I really witnessed them working as math explorers. They'd only had a little experience with elapsed time, and I didn't do any review. I saw them developing their own strategies and then teaching each other. One student proudly told me that they made their friend's brain hurt, which is a really good thing in our classroom culture. They were so engaged in making sense of the information that even though I had said they could just figure out the daylight hours for the communities that most interested them, when one student asked, "Should I do them all?" a chorus of yeses rang across the room. I felt the story and the expectation of listening and engaging respectfully gave the students a context and a motivation to explore the math. I spent time considering the principle of reciprocity for this project, and specifically a teaching from Dr. Archibald that when you've learned from a story, you have a responsibility to share that learning with others so that the knowledge from the story is sustained. The students' work about daylight was scribbled all over their charts and scrap pieces of paper, so I led them in a discussion about how we could put the information in a format that could be shared with others. This wasn't an easy task. However, we came up with a small list, and in the end, all students chose to create either a single or double bar graph to display their learning so it could be understood by others. I saw my students naturally engaging in reciprocity when they wrote to their families on a Friday during the project and described their learning. I felt this was an example of extending their sharing of knowledge outside our classroom community. We also discussed the proposed plan in BC to stay on daylight savings time year-round and the effects that would have on the areas that are in the story and on our local community. Students formed opinions about this proposed change, And with the principle of reciprocity in mind, we talked about how we could share our ideas about this in connection with Raven Brings the Light. All students wrote a letter to the local member of the Legislative Assembly. I can see how this student was using her knowledge to express concern for community and to ask for an improved situation, similar to Raven making the world a better place by bringing light to it. One final opportunity for learning from Raven Brings the Light was during our student-led conferences. I required the students to share their graphs and letters with their families to teach what they learned. This is a comment from one of the parents voicing a wish for her child to continue learning and exploring the world, specifying the interconnectedness between math, literature, and social studies. For me, respectfully working with stories through Indigenous story work principles helped me bring context and meaning to math exploration and help the students listen and work respectfully with the story's teachings. This project was my first endeavor in using Indigenous stories with math supported by the storywork principles, and I was helped by generous classmates, colleagues, and teachers. My work has only just begun. I continue to deepen my understanding of the Indigenous storywork principles to support a respectful and responsible use of story that also includes a sense of reverence and reciprocity. Now, moving from joy, finding story in a mural, Jen's work with story in the land, and how I use story in written form, I'm going to pass things on to Leanne to share her work with the supernatural Wasco, which is a story that lives in community in Haida Gwaii.
Hi, everybody. My name is Leanne Rogers, and I'm coming to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Haida Nation. So I'm the principal of a kindergarten to grade 7 school here. The name of the school is Skaganai Elementary. Initially, I was invited to be a part of this project by Joanne, and Cynthia, and I wanted to introduce our school very briefly with this particular photo. So this photo is of what we call the strongman, and it was carved by a local artist when the school was originally built. The school opened in 1999. So this was carved for our school. And if you ever come to our school, I'll show you it face to face. So the strongman is located in an area of our school where the 3 wings of the school come together, and his job is to support the entire school. And I wanted to include this photo because it sort of speaks to interrelatedness and interconnectedness, which then ties into my project as well. So originally when I was approached to do this project, I was really excited because I don't have a classroom of my own. Being the principal, I don't have a full-time classroom. And I do have a great group of colleagues here at the school. And so I went and I asked the grade 3-4 teacher last year, it was a grade 3-4 class, and I asked her if I could visit her class at least once a week to work on this math project with Wasco. So Wasco is a local supernatural being. And you can see here in the photo that Joanne Yovanovich took. This is a wooden carving of Wasco, and in English we would say sea wolf. So the legend, the myth, the supernatural story goes that there are Wascos living in a place that we now call Spirit Lake, and Spirit Lake is quite a well-traveled walking trail. I'm sure in this photo here you can see the trailhead and everything that goes along with a well-used trail. And so if you walk up Spirit Lake, at the top is Spirit Lake. And the story goes that the Wascos lived around Spirit Lake, and when they needed to eat, they would dig themselves tunnels under the ground, go down the hill, come out at the inlet, eat, go back up. So that's why the Spirit Lake trailhead has this amazing carving of what the Wasco would look like. So initially, I went into the grade 3-4 classroom, and I asked the kids what they already knew about Wascos. And I had taught grade 3 and 4 myself a number of years ago, and had known a little bit about kind of what kids knew about Wasco. And so I asked the grade 3s and 4s last year if they could tell me what they already knew about Wasco, or what their families knew, or what the stories were that they had heard. And interestingly, we did quite a bit of work around this. So we started this project with the interrelatedness between the school and the community and their homes and their parents and their relatives and anybody who might have any information that could be shared about Wasco. So kids went home, talked to their families about Wascos, came back, and then the next week we started to talk more about Wascos and get into the math part of it. So at first, I had thought that we would do a math project around elevation gain because of the fact that to get to Spirit Lake is a bit of an elevation gain, and and the Wascos were coming down the hill to get to the inlet. And so I was like, okay, we're going to do this thing on elevation gain. And I had gone around and around and around with ideas about it quite a lot. And Joanne and Cynthia were very patient in letting me sort of work through this. So, okay, we're going to do the elevation gain. So then I get into the classroom and we're talking more and more about Wascos. And one of the kids just says, I wonder how you would trap a Wasco. Like, I wonder what you would do. Like if a Wasco was trying to get you or you wanted to trap a Wasco, I wonder how you would do that. And just in that minute, I was like, I'm abandoning this elevation gain project because so many of the kids right away were like, well, you would do this and you would do that. And the trap would have to be this big and you'd need something heavy. And so like right away, I could just see that we were going to change tactics very, very quickly because there was just so much investment instantly in how you would trap a Wasco. So we did some brainstorming around that and we came up with the facts that we were going to, if we were trapping a Wasco, it had to be with items and resources that are on Haida Gwaii. So yes, you can use a tree to help trap your Wasco. It needs to be a spruce tree or an alder tree. It's not going to be an oak tree. If you're going to entice something into your Wasco trap, it would need to be foods that are readily available on Haida Gwaii. So we spent a lot of time brainstorming how exactly you would trap a Wasco. How big would it be? How big would your trap need to be? How much do you think a Wasco weighs? If you're digging a hole and a Wasco is 10 meters tall, how big is your hole going to need to be? So we did a lot of developing of our traps, and the kids designed their traps, and there's some photos coming up that'll show you some of their designs. So here we have the wood very clearly laid out for everybody to realize that is the wood. And then a series of how you would trap a Wasco. And in the end, you have a trapped Wasco. So like I say, we had to spend time, like if you were, like how would you cross hatch a trap if that was the way you were going to do it? What would have to be the length of the wood that you were going to use? So that's one example. And then here we have another one. And this one is very, this was just one example of sort of that also melding of art and math and brainstorming all those different things that kids come up with. So here's another trap of how you would trap a Wasco. And this one has some fish in the trap and then also a box that would fall onto the Wasco once it was activated from the fish. So again, it needs to be a fish that's available on Haida Gwaii, and the box was built out of wood that was available here, and how much that wood would need to weigh. And as you can see, the box is bigger than the Wasco, so it would be able to trap it. And then, and here we have another one where the kids are designing a way to entice the Wasco, and then what you would do to keep that Wasco pinned in its trap. So it was a pretty great experience. And I was really, really grateful to be a part of this experience. I'm also very fortunate in that I'm going to be able to continue this Wasco project with the same teacher, different kids. But we do have some plans for some things that we're going to do with Wascos for this year as well. Really the biggest thing that I took away from this is how integral and important it is for kids to see their own community reflected in the work that they're doing around math, and for kids to really see their ideas being validated in a mathematical way, and knowing that their ideas are very valuable, and that they're able to just connect all of those pieces, the story that their grandparents told them, the walk around Spirit Lake, the project that we're doing in class, and just how all of those things are interrelated and interconnected was probably one of the biggest things that I took away from this project. So on that note, I will turn it over to Janice. So thank you very much.
Thank you to Leanne and Sandra for sharing your pedagogical inquiry into story work and mathematics. I'm Janice Nowakowski, and I am joining you today from the unceded and traditional territories of the Hunkaminam speaking people. And at this moment in our presentation, we're having what is called a questions interlude and giving you a moment to just pause and reflect on the last two stories that you've heard and consider some questions that you might have for our storytellers. We also have a photo posted here, and you might be curious about what is the story and what is the mathematics that might emerge in discussion, and wonder about what is in this photograph. So again, I'll just give you a moment to pause and reflect. Leanne, there's a specific question for you in the chat if you want to respond to that. One of the things as you're thinking, I was reflecting too on these two presentations. I've been fortunate to hear them previously at the Northwest Math Conference, is how both Sandra and Leanne really shifted their intentional planning that they had done and the mathematics they thought they would explore with their students based on connecting back to the story work principles, as well as response and feedback from their students. So I'll wait to see if any questions come up, or if someone would like to unmute and pose a question to either Sandra or Leanne. Otherwise, I'll toss a question over to them.
If you want, Janice, I can answer the one that's in the chat.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so this actually did come up in conversation about how a Wasco would tunnel its way from Spirit Lake down to the inlet. So the kids came up with a few ideas, and one of their ideas was that the Wasco would obviously be very, very strong. And so the plan of the Wasco would be that it would dig a little bit, and it would be burrowing through making the tunnel. And the Wasco's plan would be to pass the chunks of rock back to other Wascos behind it. So essentially like a chain of Wascos carving out a tunnel. So that was one of the options that could have been an option. And then another idea that the kids had potentially was that maybe, and I'm not a geologist, but maybe the area that's right under Spirit Lake potentially is just a little bit of rock and then could be quite soft under that. So there was talk about, well, maybe you just would actually have to burrow the hard part a little bit and then it would get muddy under that and you could just keep going. So they did talk about that. I definitely would not say that that I can give you a direct answer on exactly what the land and geology is that's under Spirit Lake down to the inlet, but it was a topic of conversation with the kids for sure of how would that actually happen.
Great, thank you, Leanne. And then maybe just a question to Sandra. I'm wondering, you talked about how you sort of shifted your plans for your work with your students when you went back to the story work principles. And I'm wondering if those story work principles have influenced other areas that you're working in beyond mathematics, and where you're seeing those connections across areas of learning and maybe opening you up to seeing mathematics in other places as well, and sneaking in there like most women.
Great. Thanks, Janice. Yeah, I would say the principle that I talked about today, reciprocity, is really rung to me, but we're learning if knowledge is going to sustain through generations, then we need to be teaching what we're learning, and that that students they're teachers. They can teach each other, they can teach their adults, their caregivers, and I think that's what really came across in the student-led conferences in the end. So not just with that, but just really having that opportunity, shifting the practice of student-led conferences to showing products, to teaching our families and our caregivers about what we've been learning so that they're part of the learning process. And then I also work as a district curriculum support teacher, and I'm sort of, and while I'm working on my master's degree, and I'm just finding that I do need to, like when I learn something and I learn a teaching in any way, that I don't need to wait to process it too deeply before I start having conversations and teaching it to others, because then that reciprocal relationship does develop where my learning influences theirs and their learning comes back to me.
Thank you, Sandra. All right, thank you, everyone. If you have any further questions or ideas or connections coming up for you, please feel free to put those in the chat. And thank you to our storytellers for sharing today. And I'm going to toss it back to, I believe, Cynthia.
Thank you, Janice. I think we're going to circle back to thinking about the story work principles. And Joanne, you'd like to say a few words about the principles more holistically?
Sure. Yes, lovely. Raise my hands and thanks and respect to our 4 teacher storytellers for sharing, what you've learned, what you've experienced, some insights, some questions that you've had. And this presentation focused a fair amount on those 4 R's to help us think about becoming story work ready, to being open to learning from, with Indigenous, traditional, and life experience stories. And there other principles were also mentioned, the interrelatedness that Leanne talked about. And I think if we were looking at all of these, by having the student engagement in place on the land, being involved, with their bodies, and thinking and acting, writing a letter, to the MLA, etc., and then sharing with their families. All of that's very holistic because it addresses heart, mind, body, and spirit, and also relates to the connections that are there amongst oneself, family, community, the school, the broader society. So we have a little introduction, and with that, we hope that this sharing creates some synergy for those of you who have joined us today to perhaps spark an idea that you might be able to adapt and use from the presentations, or to think, if you want to know more about the story work principles, the Indigenous story work website, indigenousstorywork.com. I've added some videos and other resources, for those who want to really engage in this area in more depth. So we gave you, a little taste of these different principles, and that you could see not only the teachers, but the students are engaging in these principles and really working, giving their full attention to stories and learning mathematics, education, and skills at the same time. So, Cynthia, I'll turn it back to you now.
Great. Thanks, Joanne. So we want to just wrap up by inviting you to join us in thinking about threading Indigenous story work within math education. Some of the questions and kind of ideas that we've been playing with and trying to think more about are questions around: where do stories live? Where are places that we can think about Indigenous stories? And we'll have some examples for you in a second in another slide. Thinking about stories and the relationship to local place, like what are the stories around my place and where I live, and how can I learn about those stories? Thinking about becoming story work ready, Indigenous story work ready, and what's involved in doing that, and how do I begin to learn and deepen my own understanding of these principles. And I think the stories that our teachers have shared with you have helped begin that journey. And then thinking about also how we can live those principles. How do we live the principles of Indigenous story work, and what does that take? And then another point is around thinking about that across all grade levels. And often we think of stories as something to be shared at a younger age level, but we all like a good story. And we all know about how just coming together around in a circle, around the table, around the fire, outside walking, wherever we are, we love a good story. So a story doesn't need to be age defining. It can be, you know, across all levels. We just need to figure out what is the appropriate story and the story that's going to spark that curiosity. We can look for stories in various printed work and picture books. And here we have a kind of a collection of stories that go across both fiction and nonfiction. And here are more picture book stories that are also possibilities, all written by Indigenous authors. And you can find many of these books at what's it called? Iron Dog Books, which is an Indigenous owned bookstore. And Joanne, you had you found another name of an Indigenous owned bookstore that do you remember the name of that?
Yeah, it was Massey Books in Vancouver.
Massey Books, great, thank you. So those are two places that you could go to find this beyond searching online and Amazon. And then if you'd like to continue your reading with Indigenous authors in thinking more about Indigenous story work, for example, and others of helping us think more about the Truth and Reconciliation, the Indian Act, and Indigenomics. These are all examples of works that are done that could help give you more insight into that. One final area that you might be interested in is going to the Indigenous Math Network website. This is just an image from that site, and that can also lead you to some more resources and videos and images and books and problems that you could maybe try. And then finally, kind of thinking more about circling back to Kugan Khan and thinking about how stories are part of all of us and how we live by story. And Richard Ojibwe, author Richard Wagamy, says that all that we are is story. From the moment we are born to the time we continue on our spirit journey, we are all involved in the creation of the story of our time here. It's what we arrive with, and it's what we leave behind. Isn't that a beautiful way to think about wrapping up our session together? So we want to thank you very much. And oops, I wanted to go back to let you see. Give a big hawa to everybody. And here's a list of all of our participants and teachers and their contact information. And if, I don't know, I think we're kind of close to our ending time, but if you have a question that you would like us to consider, you could probably put it in the chat, or I guess we will. Oh, I have one more, sorry. I have one more slide. Where did that slide go? Okay, sorry, it's coming right here. Oh boy. It's back one. Here, I want to invite you to attend our next webinar series. We have already had the series on place and land and mathematics, and that was held November 3rd. You can visit the site located on this page or use the QR code to get you there. And there's a recording of that webinar. And today we've had Indigenous story work. In January, we will have teaching math for social and ecological justice. And we'll have one more session in March, perhaps around a culturally responsive mathematics assessment. We're still figuring out the title of that one, but it could be in that particular area. If you have a thought about what you would like us to focus on, you can always put that in the chat as well. So until then, I want to thank each of you for joining us. I want to thank each of our contributors for sharing your stories and making this day an even richer day for me. It's kind of pulled all the threads together. I felt when I started my threads were, my head threads were all over the place, but now I feel like they're kind of coming together a little bit more with the sharing of our work. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks to everyone for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at session 3. There's also an excellent webinar from last week, also on the Edith Lando website, where you can find the video from today. where Sarah Florence Davidson talks about protocols for working with Indigenous story. So what a beautiful complementary piece these two sessions were. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great night.